Ave Maria in the Afternoon is a co-production of Ave Maria Radio and EWTN Radio and carried across the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. Welcome to Ave Maria in the Afternoon, examining the world through the lens of faith from the heart of the Church to help us navigate the culture. Here's Dr. Marcus Peter.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us on this hour of Ave Maria in the Afternoon. I'm Marcus Peter. I've been meditating on a particular theme, and I recently wrote on it. It has to do with Mary and Marian doctrine being the source of healing for modern ideologies. Modern ideologies share certain common assumptions, but chief among which is with the rejection of any faith in a God who is the source of meaning, of truth, and of goodness, who is the transcendent reality of the transcendent source of all objective reality. Well, once that is cast out, then modern ideologies posit man is free to define for himself the meaning of his own existence. We know this from the proclamations of certain justices of the peace, Supreme Court justices, who've declared that at the heart of liberty is the right for man to define for himself the meaning of life and liberty in the pursuit of happiness. And therein lies the issue. Man is not free to create and recreate himself. We can make of ourselves whatever we want, but within the bounds of natural law and reality. And this, my friends, is crucial if we are to think about what it means to be a human being who flourishes. Modern ideologies push the denial of sexual difference, the dismissal of womanhood and maternity, the promise of a perfected Marxist utopia. It's delivered none of it, though. It has completely resulted in some of the most anxiety and depression-driven eras in human history. And so we have to ask ourselves, what have we done? Really, we've rejected natural law and divinely revealed law. I want to talk about how Marian doctrine is a remedy forward for us to reclaim and renew society. We go on from there to speak with Steve Soldi. Culture that is enriched by religion is the genesis of historical epochs that would not exist without cultured societies. These are true connections. They were brought out by Christopher Dawson, a Christian historical commentator, and he wrote in his writings, really, especially in the early 1900s, bringing out the reality that if we don't consider progress and religion rightly, then we will run the risk of destroying our society, quite frankly, ubiquitously. Because for him, and this is objectively true, mind you, that it is sound religion that generates sound culture, that builds sound societies, that makes sound nations. All this after the headlines. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. Joining me as he does every week is our friend Dr. Gregory Popcak. He and his bride Lisa co-host More to Life, one of the greatest hours on EWTN's national radio programming, produced by Ave Maria Radio. And they are also the founders and directors of CatholicCounselors.com and the Catholic HOM app, Households on Mission, that's hoping to help families thrive with the teachings of the theology of the body and John Paul II. Greg, great to speak with you again. How are you?
I'm doing well. Great to be here, Marcus. Thank you.
The topic we're talking about today has to do with the secular narrative that marriage and children lead to unhappiness, and unfortunately, that narrative is replete. You see artists go on media and say, "Well, my friends who are married and have children, they're some of the most miserable people. They're dead." My bride and I can't say that that's us, but I'm opening there. We have recent studies that prove otherwise.
Well, that's right. So Brad Wilcox and his team at the Institute for Family Studies just released a report that found that, in fact, both women and men who are married with children are happier than the general population, and they came to that conclusion based on survey data that was part of the General Social Survey, which is a representative sample of Americans that the National Opinion Research Council does every couple of years. They interview just thousands of people about just dozens and dozens of different questions, and then social scientists kind of get to use that as a playground, essentially, to do different studies and look at different. So what they were able to look at is that they found that 19% of married mothers said they were very happy compared to 10% of unmarried childless women. 47% of married mothers said that their lives were enjoyable, while 34% of unmarried women without children said the same. And I think a lot of this, because I've seen similar studies on this before, including the studies that say that women in particular who are married with children are less happy than everybody else. And a lot of it has to do with how the study defines happiness. Because a lot of the studies that find that women are, in particular, are less happy than other women, define happiness as just simple enjoyment or the lack of conflict or complications in life. But there is a broader definition in positive psychology that refers to what psychologists call authentic happiness. So Martin Seligman is a psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania who's considered to be kind of the father of positive psychology. And he wanted to look at when we talk about happiness, what do we really mean? Is it just enjoyment or the absence of conflict or complications, or is it something more to it? And so he actually studied people who were happy. And tried to look at, well, what's wrong with them? Why are they so unhappy all the time? And what he came to, and I'm kind of summarizing here, is three qualities that emerged that, in addition to enjoyment, of course, a pleasurable life is part of happiness. But he said that beyond that, there were three things that these happy people had that other less happy people didn't. And they basically meaningfulness, intimacy, and virtue. So meaningfulness refers to my ability to use my gifts and talents to make a positive difference in my environment and in the lives of the people around me. So I'm looking for active ways to make a positive contribution to the lives of the people around me or to my circumstances. Intimacy has to do with the strength and health and quality of the relationships that I have with the people around me. And virtue has to do, and positive psychologists actually use the term virtue, not in a spiritual or moral sense, but more in a philosophical sense. But referring to kind of character strength, right? And so the pursuit of virtue for these positive psychologists has to do with being able to use whatever life throws at me as an opportunity for growth, for learning, an opportunity to sharpen my skills, if you will. And so what they found was that the people who pursue more meaningfulness, intimacy, and virtue in their lives are, generally speaking, happier than those who don't, even people who have more enjoyable or pleasurable lives. And so when you look at happiness through that lens, I think it makes sense why you could easily say that people who are married with children are happier than people who aren't.
And the study by Brad and his team, AEI also did similar surveys some years ago, but the fact of the matter is that these results aren't just isolated to the United States. In 2012, the National Bureau of Economic Research did a similar study across 17 countries. The results were exactly the same. It's stable, monogamous marriages and children that report individuals feeling happier by that broader virtuous definition.
Well, that's right, and this particular study by Wilcox and his team, goes into more detail about why this might be. One of the reasons that they say is because marriage and family life provides more opportunities for social interaction than the single life does, and of course, social interaction is a key component of happiness. Even if you don't use the metric I was just describing for meaningfulness, intimacy, and virtue. The second thing is, interestingly, physical touch. They make a note that there aren't a lot of studies that really look at the importance of physical touch to happiness, but we are people who need affection. And I will always remind people that babies need affection even more than they need food, and we don't outgrow that really. And so. They make the point to say Americans spent 67 fewer hours per year in face-to-face social interactions in 2017 than they did in 2003. Younger Americans, aged 15 to 25, spent 140 fewer hours per year. And so with less physical interaction and less face time with each other, they describe that this is leading to kind of an epidemic of what they call touch hunger, that need to be in the in the presence of another person, interacting with them, not necessarily hugging each other all day long, but just being there with each other. The normal touches that occur between friends, or when you're in the presence of other people, it feeds our souls in a way that the digital interactions just don't.
In fact, if I may ask you to just build on that too, that we know from a wide body of research that diminished physical interaction, especially physical touch and affection, actually leads to proportionately higher anxiety and depression rates.
Well, that's right. And in fact, people tend to think that anxiety has to do with the occurrence of particular problems in our life, and of course, it doesn't not have anything to do with that. But really, what research shows is that even in the presence of problems, if I feel connected in meaningful ways to the people around me, I will be less anxious in the presence of those problems than somebody who isn't having problems but feels less connected to the people around them. So anxiety is actually a sign of a lack of connection in my life, not so much a sign of problems. And if you think about it this way, if imagine it from an evolutionary standpoint, if I'm walking through the woods by myself, I've got to watch out for those saber-toothed tigers who might be jumping out, at any moment. If I'm walking with my tribe, I know people have my back. I can relax and enjoy the scenery. Right. And so, I mean, it's a silly metaphor, but it makes the point that when we weren't created to be alone. Man is not good for man to be alone. And when we feel alone, even if we're around other people, that produces anxiety, because it's a warning to us that, hey, you shouldn't be on your own. You shouldn't be handling this all by yourself. And so, of course, marriage and children present that opportunity to not be so alone as we would if we were unmarried without children.
Which, again, goes back to what the church has been teaching all along. And if you could also comment on the fact that because of these secularist narratives, we've pushed marriage further and further down the age of an individual. And so people are waiting longer to get married. Some are just flat out opting not to get married. And we wonder why society gets more miserable and less productive.
Well, that's exactly right. And this is why the church asserts that the family is the basic unit of civilization. And I think as Catholics, we when we hear that, we kind of take it for granted. But when you compare it to the other things that could be the basic unit of civilization, the individual, for example, and when you have the individual as the basic unit of civilization, you end up with anarchy, basically because everybody's pushing their own rights, and ultimately the strong win. Right? If you have the state as the basis of civilization, now you have communism. So the family is the only unit that combines the individual with the community in a way that's meaningful and can support civilization. And this study really kind of points to that on a macro level.
Greg, always a joy to connect with you. Thank you for sharing this wisdom with us.
Always a pleasure, Marcus. Thank you.
My guest has been Dr. Gregory Popcak. He and his bride Lisa co-host More to Life. They also run the Catholic HOM app. Do look it up and find ways that our families can thrive as Catholics. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. The human heart is restless until it rests in God. This Augustinian dictum captures the fundamental truth. No political scheme or social project can ever provide ultimate peace. The modern world has spent itself in precisely such projects, though. From Enlightenment rationalism to Marxist materialism, radical feminism, and now contemporary gender theory, the effort is consistently to sever man from his given nature, to liberate him from dependence on God, and to reconstruct reality according to human will. In each of these attempts, the result has been destruction, confusion, and despair. Into this landscape, the Marian doctrine of the Church shines as a corrective of both theological and anthropological significance. Modern ideologies share a common assumption: man is free to create himself. Whether it is the denial of sexual difference in transgender theory, the dismissal of maternity in feminism, or the promise of a perfected society through Marxist revolution, all these begin by rejecting the givenness of nature. Natural law has long held that man as a rational creature discovers moral order written into creation. Aquinas argued the natural law is nothing else than the rational creature's participation of the eternal law. But the ideologies of the modern era reject this order, preferring voluntarism. Reality is what we declare it to be. And the attempt to sever man from his nature leads to incoherence. Radical feminism, promising liberation from traditional roles, has made many women suspicious of marriage and maternity. Natural law and empirical evidence both affirm that family life is where women often find deepest fulfillment. Gender ideology claims that sex is an arbitrary social construct and produces contradictions whereby children are simultaneously told that gender is fluid, but they must irreversibly transition to a chosen identity in gender. These contradictions generate psychological instability. Psychiatrist Paul McHugh observed, gender transition treatments do not resolve, but often exacerbate mental health struggles. Marxism in its various cultural adaptations also illustrates revolt against nature. By denying private property, subordinating family to the state, and replacing worship of God with political messianism, it undermines both natural law and divine law. The historical record of the 20th century demonstrates the consequences. Wherever Marxist regimes took root, they produced not utopia, but gulags, famines, the suppression of human dignity. And against this revolt stands Mary, full of grace. Her existence, her fiat, her role in salvation history, all these provide a theological and anthropological remedy to modern errors. The dogma of the Immaculate Conception teaches that Mary was preserved free from original sin from the first moment of her conception. This doctrine proclaims that grace is prior to human effort. In a world obsessed with self-creation, Mary reminds humanity life is a gift, not a project. She didn't fashion herself, she received her identity from God. Pius IX declared in Ineffabilis Deus, she was adorned with the abundance of all heavenly gifts, far beyond all the angelic spirits and all the saints. Her purity, therefore, is not the product of willful self-determination, but of divine election. This truth repudiates the modern myth of autonomous self-invention. The perpetual virginity of Mary affirms the integrity of the human person against a culture of commodification. Modern sexual ideologies treat the body as an object of pleasure, subject to modification at will. But Mary lived her sexuality in total consecration to God. Her virginity is not repression, it's radical receptivity. It reveals that human dignity is not reduced to sexual utility. John Paul II, in his Theology of the Body, identified this as the spousal meaning of the body. Man and woman are created not to dominate, but to give themselves, and Mary embodies this gift in totality. At the heart of Marian doctrine is her title, Theotokos, Mother of God. In affirming this title at the Council of Ephesus, the Church declared not only a truth about Mary, but also a truth about Christ, that he is fully God and fully man. Against ideologies that pit body against spirit or deny the sanctity of life, Mary, as mother, confirms the dignity of embodied humanity, and in her womb the eternal Son took flesh. This truth restores value to motherhood, to childhood, to the family, realities that are under constant assault in contemporary culture. Finally, the Assumption of Mary. It proclaims that she, at the end of her earthly life, was taken body and soul into heavenly glory, and this dogma proclaims the destiny of the human body. Modern ideologies treat the body as disposable, a shell to be manipulated or discarded. Abortion, euthanasia, gender mutilation, all testify to this bad logic. The Assumption answers with hope. The body is destined not for disposal, but for glorification. Pius XII stated in Munificentissimus Deus, the Assumption directs the attention of men to the future resurrection of their bodies. From a philosophical perspective, then, Marian doctrine restores the unity of being that modern ideologies fragment. Secular anthropology fractures man into autonomous will and meaningless matter. Mary, in her unity of soul and body, virginity and maternity, shows the harmony of human existence when lived in accord with God's design. Modern ideologies exacerbate alienation. Radical autonomy isolates the person from community. Gender theory fragments the self, producing confusion and instability. By contrast, Marian spirituality fosters integration. Devotion to Mary cultivates humility, receptivity, and contemplative peace. Psychological studies repeatedly show that religious practice and maternal bonding are strong predictors of mental health and resilience. Mary embodies both realities. She is the archetypal mother, but she is also a perfect disciple. History provides ample testimony to the consequences of revolting against nature and God. The French Revolution, as I mentioned yesterday, in its attempt to enthrone reason and abolish Christianity, devolved into terror and tyranny. The Soviet experiment rejected God and natural family, and more recently, Western societies embracing sexual libertinism and gender ideology. And now what's happening? We're facing demographic collapse, rising suicide rates, cultural fragmentation, breakdown of the family. The correlation is evident. Denial of natural law breeds destruction, always and everywhere. And by contrast, where Marian devotion has flourished, culture has often been renewed. The Marian age of the 13th century produced saints like Francis and Dominic. The Rosary, championed at Lepanto, rallied Christendom against destructive forces. In modern times, apparitions like Lourdes and Fatima renewed faith amid secularist advance. Mary has consistently been the remedy when false ideologies threaten the integrity of the human person in the Church. Ultimately, Marian dogma points to Christ. Every truth about Mary safeguards a truth about her Son. The Immaculate Conception protects the gratuity of grace. The divine maternity safeguards the Incarnation. The Assumption proclaims the resurrection of the body. To affirm Marian truth is to affirm the gospel. To reject Marian truth is to risk distorting Christ and man alike. The Second Vatican Council summarized this with clarity. Mary, the exalted daughter of Zion, helps all her children, wherever they may be, to find in Christ the way to the Father's house. The Church holds Mary is before the world not as rival to Christ, but as his perfect disciple. Her life is the definitive answer to the restless quest for identity, dignity, fulfillment. The ideologies of modernity promised liberation, but they've delivered to us only bondage and destruction. They reject nature, and they cannot lead us to flourishing. They deny God, and because of that, they cannot offer grace and eternal life. Mary reveals both nature perfected and grace triumphant, and that's why she is the new Eve. By her fiat and great obedience, she undid the knot of the disobedience of the first Eve. She is the mother of all the living, who by her Son's cross becomes mother of all the redeemed. The remedy for modern confusion is not new ideology, but renewed fidelity to Jesus Christ, in whom alone man truly finds himself. Marian doctrine directs us to that fidelity. It teaches us to receive, not to construct, to obey, not to rebel, to hope, not to despair. And in a time of fragmentation, Mary offers integration. In a time of cynicism, Mary becomes a symbol that offers hope. And in a time of anthropological crisis and confusion, she reveals to us the true dignity of man as creature, as child, and as heir of the kingdom of God. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. Culture enriched by religion is the genesis of historical epochs that would not exist without cultured societies. Now, to that end, we can only hope that culture can continue to steer societies away from the desacralized way of death towards a sacralized way of life. In short, religion becomes the basis of the formation of a culture, a nation's identity. Joining me to have a conversation about this and his recent article, Religion, the Basis of Culture, is Steve Soldi. Steve took his BA in English from the College of the Holy Cross and his MA in the Humanities from the University of Dallas. And like I mentioned, most recently he penned this article in the Public Discourse, Religion, the Basis of Culture. Steve, thank you for joining us. How are you?
Thanks for having me, Dr. Peter. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Very well. And I have a great appreciation for Christopher Dawson's writings, so I greatly appreciated the way in which you drew from his assertions, and rightly so, you drew from progress and religion. And one of the things that Dawson highlights is that culture really becomes an overflow of a nation's adopted religion, or at least a society's adopted religion. So lose religion, lose culture. Help us understand that.
Sure. So Dawson observed how religious beliefs and ideals have expressed themselves throughout various civilizations, which led him to conclude that religion is the key to understanding human history and culture. From his wide-ranging study of historical societies, it seemed to him that a society and its cultural achievements cannot be understood apart from the religious beliefs that lie behind them. He thought that the religious spirit is most evident in the creative works of culture, such as visual art, architecture, music, and literature. He also thought that all philosophical and educational systems in history were dedicated to a religious end. Some of the best historical examples of these systems are what was produced by the Sumerian and Egyptian temple priesthoods, the Brahmin caste in ancient India, and, of course, the clergy and the monastic orders in medieval Christendom.
So, go ahead, please.
No, I'm good.
Okay.
You can go ahead.
Yeah. So, considering that, then, as you've mentioned, it's inevitable that the adopted religion of a society becomes the primary way in which the cultus of the society develops, and so everything that overflows from it becomes what we now know as culture. And that's one of the reasons why we're seeing this tremendous struggle in post-Christian America right now. So I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yes, I think that's a great observation. One thing that the one thing that I think helps maybe kind of formulate this a little better for people is if we go back to Dawson's kind of way that he describes culture. He calls it the form of society, and it's a kind of a tricky term, form.
Yeah,
I think it's helpful to use the way in which Thomas Aquinas defines a human person to understand that term. Aquinas, as you know, follows Aristotle in defining a human person as hylomorphic, a term that derives from the Greek words hyli, meaning matter, and morphe, meaning form. In other words, a human person is a composite of form and matter, where the soul is its form and the body is its matter. I think if we relate this definition of human person to Dawson's understanding of society, I think it may help clarify some of these ideas for people and see how that relates to your point you just mentioned. Because culture is the soul of society, and the individual persons are obviously the matter. So according to Dawson, culture informs and transforms the diverse human material of which it is composed. So what logically follows is that without culture, a society would reduce to its matter. We may be seeing that today, as you mentioned, or as Dawson says, it's reduced, quote, to a crowd or a collection of individuals brought together by the needs of the moment, end quote. His argument seems to hinge on the fact that society could never be simply a collection of individuals without form. A society of individuals requires a soul to animate them, just as a human person does, and we have to look to where that soul is. And if we don't have one, we obviously resort to scientism and materialism.
Right. And that's a crucial insight, because by virtue of that, we understand that when culture has a sound religious worldview, a holistic one like the Judeo-Christian worldview, then its anthropology gets right. The way it views the human person is right. And so culture is built around that. But when religion is jettisoned, especially the Christian faith is jettisoned, you will see that culture and society also denigrate the human person. You wrote about this, especially in Thomistic terminology, hylomorphism. Would you comment on that, please?
Yeah, so I think that the hylomorphic understanding is crucial to this point. If we see these things as kind of separated substances, think of more of a Cartesian understanding. There is no kind of animation that comes through. So I think if we have the Judeo-Christian foundation, the religious spirit as the soul of the society, then we will see how that body of persons is animated differently than if they had a disconnected soul or a soul that was informed poorly.
And this disconnection, this poor formation, is what leads to a lot of the modern social ills that we are seeing. You consider, for example, the transgender ideology, the transhumanist ideology. And so, in that sense, looking back at Dawson's witness, as you rightly highlight, culture really isn't completely man-made. There's something almost divine about the influence of culture.
For sure. I think it's very clear in Dawson throughout all of his writings. It's kind of why he's the historian of culture, historian of religion. He held philosophy of religion chairs. He was obviously the inaugural chair of the Roman Catholic Studies at Harvard from 58 to 62. And I think that he boils it all down to religion as being a mysterious force. And he knows that that's a supernatural idea. But he can't not see that historical societies, as seen in the examples I mentioned from the East and the West, are founded on religion. In his view, the relationship between religion, individuals, culture, and society creates what I call a chain reaction, and it plays out like this. Religion affects individuals, individuals affect culture, and culture affects society. Fundamentally, if you think about it, religion is the unifying force in that formula. As such, according to Dawson, every historical culture represents a theogamy, a term derived from the Greek words theos, meaning God, and gamos, meaning marriage.
Right.
In other words, only a marriage between the supernatural and the natural can produce the energy required for the creation of culture.
And considering that, like you mentioned, this theogamy, this coming together of the divine and the human, you look at the history of anthropology, as Dawson did, and you realize that this is precisely how human cultures and societies have always functioned. It's not isolated to just Christendom and the Judeo-Christian worldview. And so the modern secularist narrative is fallacious if it claims that man can build culture without connecting with the divine.
Very true. I think it's clear in this essay that I was extrapolating upon that he really takes on that point and the conception that societies that are religious are backwards or lack progress. I think it's right to note that he says, quote, religion holds society in its fixed cultural pattern, but it also leads the people through the wilderness and brings them back from the captivity and inspires them with the hope of future deliverance, end quote. So any honest academic knows that social change is an intricate process with no easy solution. But
let's pause there. My guest is Steve Soldi. He has a BA in English from the College of the Holy Cross, MA in Humanities from the University of Dallas. Recently penned an article called Religion, the Basis of Culture. Continuing on the other side of the break. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter, talking with Steve Soldi, who recently penned an article in the public discourse called Religion, the Basis of Culture. And he's drawing from the wisdom of Christopher Dawson, particularly in his significant work, this work that I believe everyone ought to read at least once, called Progress and Religion. So, Steve, I want to pick up where we left off about this reality that man cannot build culture without being connected with the divine. So we got cut off at the end of the last segment. Let's pick up from there.
For sure. I was just trying to point out that Dawson thinks that culture is intensely dynamic because of the religious spirit. And as you rightly pointed out multiple times, Dr. Peter, that it's just not in the narrative that a lot of the academics want to tell these days. But I think that any honest academic knows that social change is an extremely intricate process with no easy solution. So although the historian has difficulty identifying the relative impact of cultural factors on society, he or she cannot deny that the creative force of new religious beliefs and doctrines has a greater impact on culture than, say, new political ideas, new scientific discoveries, new technological innovations and advancements that I think a lot of the narratives tend to lean on and tend to discard the religious spirit underlying them.
And it's a complete attempt at an epistemological novelty, the reluctance to accept that the classical way of viewing the human person in society and culture is in fact the way that we thrive. So to deviate a little from the content of the article proper, but to also address its core, this like you mentioned earlier, the materialism, scientism, it promised a lot of good and it's delivered a lot of harm. Just comment on that briefly for us.
Yeah, I think I see it most in my high school students that are really disenfranchised and disenchanted. I think of Charles Taylor's magnus opus, A Secular Age. He traces this secularization narrative. It's been sliced and diced in so many different ways. Mm-hmm. But I think what the young people that I work with are really yearning for is enchantment, is some kind of reinvigoration in their life. I think of Dawson, who converted to Catholicism in 1914. He wrote an interesting essay in 1926 entitled Why I Am Catholic. And I think he really hits the nail on the head when he says, from the time I was 13 or 14, I had come to know the lives of the Catholic saints and the writings of medieval Catholic mystics, and they made so strong an impression on my mind that I felt that there must be something lacking in any theory of life which left no room for these higher types of character and experience. And I want to highlight that point of the higher types. And it seems that, as you said, in the classical conception of the cosmos, there was a clear interaction between the higher types of the heavens and the lower types of the earth.
And the moment we stopped looking at higher things, the moment we stopped being, in this case, transcendental, we just destroyed man as a result. If you could just share about how this irreligious new perspective, this materialist perspective, has generated a tremendous amount of bloodshed throughout recent history.
Yes, that's very true. And I think at the root of it, it's just an extreme amount of angst and all the things that come with that. It's interesting to see Dawson's kind of work in culture. I think a lot of the way the culture derives from the Latin word cultura, and that idea that it's a horticulture, the assisted growth of living things. I think that we as humans want to participate in that life-giving process. And I just wonder if the lack of that conception and the fact that we do have some kind of control over the culture that we create is why the things have been so derailed throughout, as you said, recent history.
So, considering that, if we, one of the secularist lies, right, is that religion becomes the obstacle for which society, that hinders society's progress. And Christopher Dawson presents us this wondrous worldview of knowing that is not only the opposite. Religion becomes the true vehicle of human flourishing. Just share with us why that is.
Yeah, I think that it relates to the metaphor at the end of my essay, and it comes back to my point about cultura as being the root of culture. And I'll share a story about how this all came to my mind, and it's kind of cute, and I think your audience may enjoy it. So, as I was thinking about this idea of culture and Dawson and religion, the basis of culture, my 7-year-old son and I happened to be transplanting an oak seedling on our property. So while being horticulturalists and explaining to him the life cycle of plants, it dawned on me that a neat metaphor for Dawson's cultural theory could be one that combines horticulture and the life cycle of plants.
Yep.
The more I thought about the progression of seed to root to plant to flower, mapping onto Dawson's schema of religion, individuals, culture, and society, the more I was convinced that I think there is a fruitful metaphor here, and the metaphor works like this. So the seed of religion germinates the way of life in individuals. The way of life roots the individuals in cultural soil fertilized by divine power and mystery. The root of culture then grows into the plant of society that reflects its divine source, and then the plant of society finally blooms into a fruitful civilization that intelligently and constructively orders itself around a shared vertical axis, which is that higher form that we know as religion.
Just based on that, which, by the way, I greatly appreciate the analogy. But I found it to be very apropos. And based on that, and going to
I'm glad.
going to an assertion that you made midway through your article about the Second Vatican Council and it being, first of all, a legitimate development in the life of the church, but second of all, the pushback that we've seen in particular subcultures that you rightly note as a form of entrenched antiquarianism. Can you talk about how accepting these developments doesn't mean that one, therefore, is casting away the classical roots that bring about true cultural flourishing?
Exactly. I think that the tradition is dynamic, and I think Dawson would agree with that statement. There's a way to think of tradition as being stagnant. I think of St. John Henry Newman, who was about to be declared a doctor of the church, and his theology of history definitely took a dynamic view. I would imagine Dawson knew Newman, haven't done any study on that, but the way that he explains kind of history's progress seems to be out of that same vein. So one thing that, I try and teach young people is that, the synthesis that we are undertaking here in the church in particular is something that's still unfolding. It's not fully realized, and people see the frustrations along the way. I think at the time in the 1940s and 50s, there was, wisdom, as I mentioned in my article, from Pope Pius XII, about this is an unfolding. It's not that it's going to be realized tomorrow. This is going to take 100 years potentially, if you think about church history and the way that church councils have played out. It's not an immediate answer to the moment. Mm-hmm. And I think the Second Vatican Council and the Council Fathers set up a synthesis that just we haven't seen it completely form. Mm-hmm. And what I do appreciate is that, some of these subgroups, as I mentioned and you mentioned, are bringing, some fruitful things to the table that I think we do have to be heeding and not just discarding. So, I do appreciate things when it comes to the liturgy, and that's a hot topic, as we know, in our church these days. And I think that we can learn from some of the traditionalists in that way, and rediscover some of the things that may have been forgotten.
If we can also just quickly analyze the flip side, we've been having this conversation about the form of society, the form of culture, and therefore the form of religion. And when we talk about substance and accidents of form and matter, the language here is clear that even as things change, to borrow John Henry Newman, there are core tenets that remain the same, and that's what true development really looks like. When we see innovations, particularly in terms of individuals who seek to change the moral teaching of the church, that would bring about rightful moral indignation and therefore a kind of revolt on the part of people who strive for fidelity to the church. So can you comment on that as well?
Yeah, there's definitely accountability in this process. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's rightful, like you said, indignation, not being afraid to challenge some of the narratives that are coming from the authority. Now so much with our social media, it's easy to find critiques of these things and to even hear about, the news of who's espousing what in the church, for sure. So, I think there is a great level of accountability. that we need in the church. I'm definitely open to that. It's just a matter of let's not condemn the church council. That's where I think we have to draw the line.
Oh, absolutely. I'm with you. And that's what true development really looks like. Steve, thank you very much for making the time to speak with us.
Of course. I really appreciate it, Dr. Peter. Have a great day.
You too. My guest has been Steve Soldi. He holds an MA in Humanities from the University of Dallas, penned this lovely article, Religion, the Basis of Culture, on Public Discourse. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.